Good morning. Barry is in Belfast doing some work.
Hey everybody.
Hey, we thought we'd have a little conversation, as we often do when you're in town.
Yeah,
we occasionally even do it online, but we'll occasionally talk to each other in private. Yeah. But we're going to do this for you as well. The idea was, we were talking about drugs, psychedelics,
we were.
the medicine, and we were thinking it might be fun to kind of talk a little about that, because it's kind of back in the zeitgeist.
Very much so, and more in the kind of spiritual world, in a kind of underground way, and a lot. I think that's how we sort of started talking about it. That we know a lot of things that people are experimenting with, but it's not too much talk about it in the circles that we inhabit. So we just thought it'd be a good idea to have a chat about.
Yep. So that's what we're going to do.
Psychedelics.
And this is the area that I think you know a lot about, is that this is not the first time that spirituality and psychedelics became part of a mainstream conversation.
Yeah, no, it's not. I mean, they always say history repeats itself, and you know, there seem to be some correlations, at least to my mind, on some levels, with this kind of resurgence of interest in psychedelics on both a kind of, I suppose you'd call it a spiritual level, but also on a medicinal level. And you know, when in the post-World War II era, you know, in the 50s and 60s, when there was a lot of social upheaval, there was a very big exploration of certain psychedelics, particularly like LSD. But interestingly, there's this guy, Gene Youngblood, who wrote a book on cinema, and he wrote in the 70s, but he called like the late 60s and 70s the era of cosmic consciousness. And in one of his books, he said, mysticism is upon us, and it arrives with science and psilocybin. And, you know, there was this so in that sort of period, there was this resurgence of interest in mysticism. There was an involvement of science and an exploration of things like, you know, magic mushrooms, psilocybin, LSD, and stuff like that. And now here we are in another sort of period of upheaval on so many levels, where nobody's really sure which way is up anymore, and lots of things seem to be coming apart at the seams. And once again, we find ourselves, for different reasons, I think, and in different settings, exploring some of these avenues of whatever that is. And we were talking about this whole idea of how this relates to the idea of the subject, you know, what it is to be human and how we navigate and negotiate. What I think is really interesting is, you know, in the like 50s and 60s, there was a lot of medical research on things like LSD. There was a whole project of psychoanalysis and LSD for anxiety and depression. I mean, very famously, there was a clinic, I think it was called the Institute of Psychiatric Health, in the heart of Beverly Hills, where people like Cary Grant used to go weekly for doctor-mandated LSD trips to address sort of issues. And then in the late 60s, the federal government declared LSD illegal, and all of that research stopped, and it sort of went into the underground, and it got taken in whole new directions, you know, music, sexuality, countercultural things, and the sort of meanings, I don't know, meanings is the right word, but thinkings around it sort of shifted, and it became this, you know, pathway to enlightenment, to seeing God and all that kind of stuff. And a lot of those things are sort of carrying on today, but the subtle difference is, you know, we've got this kind of microdose culture where there are these very small incremental steps to address stuff. But I don't know, we were just talking about this and just thought, why not think about this, this relationship between maybe, I don't know, the ecstatic and the medicinal with subjectivity in the middle.
Yeah, I know, because like the reason why we're having this conversation is partly because like I don't have a clear sense of what I think, because for example, there's people take these kind of things for fun, for potential medical reasons, for therapeutic reasons, or to encounter the truth, right? Those are kind of like you go like it's either kind of a way to encounter some deep truth about the universe, to connect with that truth. Say it's just a fun thing to do. There might be some medicinal, physical, biological reasons, and there might be some therapeutic reasons. And there's an argument that is very radical, and there's an argument that is very conservative. So some drugs can be seen as very radical because they maybe open up new vistas of reality and help you see or encounter truth. Or it's a really good way to keep workers who are alienated in their material circumstances to kind of at the weekend take some drugs. It takes away revolutionary spirit and allows you to live with intolerable material conditions. And I can see aspects of all of this. It's hard to kind of navigate or work through.
Yeah, well, I think it actually was Timothy Leary who had this like idea about psychedelics and what he called set and settings. And so basically the environment and the context in which you take these things will frame and shape the way you experience the drug. So if you're in an environment where everybody's talking about, well, you take this and you're going to experience, union with the universe or oneness, or you're going to encounter God or something, and you're in an environment where that kind of feeling is generated, chances are you might wind up having those experiences. If you're in one where you're in an environment where you're trying to deal with a depression or an anxiety, and it's kind of in a medical environment, and it's being given to you as a kind of tablet to take away your pain or whatever, your encounter with it might be really different.
But also, I mean, also something that comes up, because we've had a few of these conversations, so I think I should say at this point that when I was in LA as a bit of an anthropologist, I have experienced what we're talking about, and that you can talk about your experience. You have a lot more experience than I have.
I grew up in a sort of fairly heavy drug culture, in particularly in my youth, but along the way that I've sort of revisited at various times different aspects of that, because I do think it's interesting. I think, for instance, when I was young, and I had a group of friends, and we used to take a psychedelic almost every week, like on a Friday night. It was a thing that we did. You went to the pub, you took something, and then that was how we did that. And then later in life, I was like, well, what was that all about, and how do I experience those things now? And particularly when things started to come back around. I hadn't thought about psilocybin for a long time, because that was we used to have this New Year's ritual. This girl that we knew lived down in this cottage by a river. She was like a little elf. You know what I mean? She used to read tarot cards for everybody on New Year's Eve, and she used to make magic mushroom tea, and that was how we saw in the new year. But I hadn't thought about that for years. But in California, there's long been a kind of cultish interest in psilocybin, which has exploded alongside, real food and earth consciousness and all that stuff. So I think we both have stories, you know.
And the reason why I mention that is simply because some people go, oh, well, have you experienced that? Yeah, we're talking also from knowing this stuff, you more than me, but yeah, I definitely, when you're in LA, it's like it's part of the landscape in some circles. But my experience then there is some people I know that it has exacerbated psychotic symptoms. So some people have fallen into very much being more divorced from reality, starting to, the usual kind of stuff, like, talking to aliens or whatever, and they really believe they are. Yeah. But then for some others, it's been therapeutically help with anxiety. Yeah. And so you kind of, again, it's like, that's where I'm very suspicious of any blanket claims of what it is, because there's lots of different experiences, and some of them have been very positive, some of them I've seen have been...
I mean, I read recently somewhere that there was a big study on ketamine and depression, and the success of that with a lot of people. But in that report, nobody reported any encounter with some ecstatic, mystical entity. You know what I mean? But outside of that, in a different environment, you can have the feeling that you're actually encountering those things, which I think is the interesting part of the conversation about subjectivity, reality, and what that is, and how we frame it with our lives, and what this resurgence is really getting at. Yeah. And again, it's for lots of different reasons, like you said, and with different results.
Yes. Because the book that I'm reading at the moment, that we're reading at the Patreon, is Camus' Myth of Sisyphus. Yeah. And the interesting thing about that book, one of the reasons why I really like it as a text, is, and I'm sure Camus was a man who, like in that book, actually, he really valorizes experiences. So I'm sure he was doing a lot of drugs, but he's definitely having a lot of relationships and having a good time. But his main kind of position, as you know, is that to live as a subject is to be able to live in the absurdity of our existence, which means for him to be able to, we have a desire for meaning, satisfaction, for certainty. We have a universe that seems to refuse or be indifferent to that desire, and we have to kind of live in the middle of it. And in that book, he's very good at saying that even the philosophers and the thinkers and the people who embrace the absurd then try to find some way to leap out of it. Yeah. And my initial suspicion about things like psilocybin, and I've changed in this, but my initial suspicion from some people I knew as well is that this is an attempt to leap out of living in and working through what it is to live in the absurd, to actually live with anxiety, with depression, with melancholy, to find a way to courageously tarry with that. Yeah. But I'm also very open to the idea that sometimes, and you were very keen on this actually, if I tell this story, because I think I remember talking to you about this and going, listen, these drugs are so associated with perennial philosophy, which is, the oneness of the universe, breaking out of kind of language and entering into your kind of true self, all of that kind of language. Yeah. And which, I think is a weak philosophy. And you were the ones who said, but it's not necessarily tied to that. Yeah. And drugs are not, and you said, like, the punks don't think like that, you were doing like, and that made me go, okay, maybe psilocybin isn't necessarily woven to perennial philosophy. It just happened to be that in the 70s and the 60s.
And I think that part of that is because when the scientific research, and I'm not saying that that's better, but I do think that the fact that the scientific research was declared illegal and all of that sort of social research stopped, and then it went underground and into the subculture and the counterculture, where there was already a kind of hunger to break out of the particular absurdities of 60s, 70s cultural life. that's partly where that kind of gained a bit of traction, you know.
Yes, and this is a weird counterintuitive thing for people, is that we sometimes think of this black market in the underground as where all the edgy stuff happens, and that's kind of a, but in some respects people turn to that because their lives are so intolerable. Yeah. So your lives are intolerable, you buy these drugs, they help temporarily, just like musicals during the Great Depression were a way that people temporarily forgot about the horror of the material circumstances, watched a crazy musical, and then that helped them. In the same way, you go in, you take these drugs, but that in a sense is an inherently conservative position because it doesn't transform your material conditions. In a sense, potentially is a type of tranquilizer. Makes you feel good for a few hours, but like even your childhood, when you grew up in a working class English fucking world where it was tough. Yeah, and I'm guessing some of the things that you took were ways to escape.
Oh, definitely ways to kind of just looking for an alternate reality to the one that you find yourself in, but in some ways an escapist reality. Now, I you know, I mean, Freud, you know, in Civilization and Its Discontents, he talks about, you know, the palliatives, and he talks about intoxicants as one of the ways that we sort of deal with the struggles of life. And he doesn't dismiss the fact that we need to do that. I mean, you know, it's like Marx, when Marx declares religion as the opiate of the masses, he's not actually just trashing, he's saying basically we have to be, if you like, a better opiate, a better way of looking at reality. And even, you know, I mean, I'll quote the Bible, well, not exactly quote the Bible, but in the book of Proverbs it says, let the poor drink wine to forget their trouble. So there is this sense in which we do need the occasional escape valve. The challenge comes when that escape valve becomes the framework for how you look at where you are in the world, and it becomes this disjuncture between you and the world that you find yourself in, rather than the sort of Camus move, which is like, no, the absurd. It's absurd. There is no real alternative to the absurdity of existence. And if you think about it, we're thrown into the world, you know, whichever philosophy you want to go with. But, you know, we come from somewhere but nowhere. You know, we weren't, and then we are, and then we're not again. That's absurd. You know, life in a sense is beautifully, weirdly, strangely absurd. And the struggle to come to terms with that, it's huge.
Yeah. And one of his heroes of the absurd, he has the lover, the actor, the creator, these kind of figures that he uses to try to say, what does it look like to embrace the absurd? And it's funny because he does say at one point, he says, yes, but these are examples, like anybody can do it. Which I think is absolutely true. In fact, I think he valorizes certain things too much. But his thing about the actor is interesting because he says an actor, and he's thinking of theatre rather than movies, because an actor who acts a part that's not recorded, that's just, you know, an actor plays a part for 3 hours. They live like a king or a beggar or a great warrior, and then it's over. He says this is a kind of an example of the absurd. Is you do want to go out and have experiences, and the actor has experiences of different lives and all that, but they also know that it's limited, and they don't pretend that they're that forever. In the same way, he doesn't talk about things like psilocybin, but I think what Camus might say is, if you're thinking of it as the answer, as you know, then that's the escape from the absurd. If this is something you're doing, as you say, it's a palliative where you go like, you need to relax, you need to have you even work something through. The thing about psilocybin's interesting is it's almost like a waking dream. So there's something being worked through, and that's great. It's when it's inflated And I see this so much because it's hard not to inflate it. Like the first time you do something like MDMA, it's like, oh my god, but people inflate it to be almost like it's the religious answer. It's the new religious answer.
Well, it becomes very much the new enlightenment. The new sort of, I've awoken my consciousness.
Yeah.
I don't think you've awoken your consciousness. I just think you maybe have realized that your consciousness is far more complex. And I read a couple of months ago a book called On Hashish by Walter Benjamin, which is an account of his experiences with hashish.
Oh, very interesting.
Which is, and it's funny because there's none of that talk in this book whatsoever. Yeah. And what I found really interesting is it's a very sort of, his first encounter was really kind of not great, which can, it was like, it didn't even work, which I've known a few people that have gone, oh, this stuff doesn't work on me. Yeah. And I'm like, no.
Just take more.
But then he has an encounter, but he's like really thinking about what's going on and recording it, which I found quite fascinating, and in the middle of all of this, there are accounts of what's going on in his life and the realization that what's going on in his life actually has an impact on how he experiences the particular encounter with the drug. And so there are so many ways. There's not a singular way of thinking about this, but I do think what, and I was, even as you were talking, I was thinking about those experiences when I was young, and it wasn't that I was just trying to escape. There was definitely a part of it, you just want to be out of your head because, working class life is shit, combined with the frustration of youth and all of that stuff. But really what I was trying to do was come to terms with or recognize that the experiences that the limitations of the world that I were in were constructs that were holding me. And what interested me particularly with LSD, and when I was growing up, there wasn't much weed in Britain, so people smoked a lot of hash, which is much more opiate-like. Yeah. So there was a lot of dreamy, a bit like mushrooms, and what I realized in those things was the porousness of what it means to be a subject, that we frame our world so tightly. Yeah. We're so convinced we know the nature of reality, and we really don't.
Yeah. No, that's true. But here's my...
Yeah, give me your 50 cents.
For my 50 cents. I'm just trying this stuff out. So a concern, and this is not, there's an ethical dimension to what I'm going to say, but there's also just a philosophical dimension, which for me is any time that one's access to the truth is mediated by either travel, drugs, books, as in, someone says, to really understand the world and get a real sense of who you are, you need to travel, or to really get to know your consciousness, you need to take drugs, or you need access to various philosophies, the more different worldviews there. The ethical dimension of that, first of all, means, so access to the truth is only for a small number of people, right? Exactly. So that's the first thing. So it's like, you can only access the truth if you've got multitude of diverse philosophies sources, or if you've got access to drugs, or if you've got access to travel. And then access to the truth becomes bourgeois. Yeah. Because who has the access to the universities, to the drugs, to the travel, the wealth.
And there is that whole thing with a lot of the drug culture,
Yeah.
therapeutic thing today that's very much in the realm of the bourgeois.
Oh yes,
With your personal guru and your shaman, and
and with this really interesting self-righteousness of almost like we're enlightened. Like, so for me, and like you are more like this, but you're a real hero of the working class. It's like no, everyone has access. Like the working class, like everyone has access, and in fact, and that's a very Hegelian point. So for Hegel, again, I had this with a course I ran recently where people were saying about getting more diverse voice or whatever. But the Hegelian idea is wherever you are, you are accessing the truth always already in your being, and you don't even have to go deep into yourself and deep meditative practices that you learn or whatever. It's like the truth is on the surface of Freudian. The truth is on the surface. Now, the reason why I say all of that is because I almost think that the truth, and this is the Camus thing again, it's coming back to reading him, but it's like the truth is on the surface is the absurd. We very quickly in our everyday life experience living in contradiction. And so in some respects, I think drugs, even at their best, are a way for us to handle the truth maybe, sometimes to avoid the truth. So at their worst, they're attempting to avoid the truth. At their best, they might be a way for us to get respite from the truth. Like when Nietzsche said, we invented art so that we will not die of the truth. So in some respects, you go, well, do we have these palliatives so that we do not die of the truth? Because there's something, and then if you take that angle to kind of do, it's almost like that the truth is your anxiety, is your symptoms, is your suffering. That's the truth that in psychoanalysis you have to face. You have to kind of, in some respects, learn to work through. A friend of ours who was here last night, a psychoanalyst, that Freud used the term working through. I didn't even define it that tightly, but this beautiful term to work through. And that's open to everybody. And so I guess I always want to reject this idea that drugs kind of like give you this higher insight. I almost think they give you they give you respite from higher insight.
I mean, they're sometimes it can feel, they're just reductive explanations that are kind of meaningless, really. They're framed in. It's like, when you haven't been in a church for a long time. And then you go in and you hear a phrase that you've heard 20 years ago, like the exact same phrase. And you hear that a lot in drug culture, this is blah, 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 and you get that. I think Eric Davis, who writes a lot about this stuff, he calls them poetic facts. You know what I mean? In inverted commas, it's like we're making facts out of a kind of a thing that's not.
Oh, that's very good. It's almost like we're having a really interesting experience, and somehow trying to that's probably like reading a poem and then trying to create a systematic
like a systematic theology of it.
So you're almost living a poem. That's an interesting way to say it.
I did write down this thing about this in Europe when they were exploring psychoanalysis and the psychedelics, and They used a lot of Winnicott, which was interesting, and his whole idea of the transitional experience and non-specific amplifiers that they sort of saw the psychedelics as a kind of almost like a regression back to sort of smallness in the vastness of life, and they were really interested in the effect, the real effect on the understanding of the self, of the subject, and they sort of said basically that it unsettled the sort of mechanisms of convention that just sort of trap you from actually working through your working towards a firmer embrace of the absurd, I would say, given.
That's it, because that was my experience with psilocybin. I think that
they said, they said it disrupts the narrative self, this story that we tell ourselves. It's a disruption of that, because that's a narrow story. And we were talking about that a little bit last night, that we live in this era of self-identifying labeling, which I completely understand. But there is the argument that does hem you in.
Yes.
Or can hem you in. And they sort of made the case that part of the experience with the psychedelics was a disruption of that narrative self, because you suddenly realize, oh, wait a minute, there's more going on to me than I imagined.
Yes.
Or rather, now I imagine that there's more going on to me.
Yeah.
But anyway, what were you going to say?
Yeah, well, kind of on that, like, I think my experience of it was disruptive in the sense of, yes, it kind of like, and that can be an experience you get from a piece of music or a walk in the park, but there are these moments in our lives that you shake us up.
Yeah.
And they shake it almost so the things kind of filter down differently. And that's a good way of thinking about my experience. And two things happened to me whenever I did my a proper psilocybin trip, because I was one of those people where it didn't work on me the first few times, and I had to take a
we
lot.
talked about that.
Yeah, it was like just nothing. I would be with people, they'd be meeting God, and nothing, just a little bit brighter.
Yeah.
But I did on my own. I did a large dose, and as I said, two things that came out of it is, one is I stopped drinking entirely. And I didn't even drink very much. I was a drinker, like I would socially drink. So, but I wasn't going into it going, I want to.
Yeah.
It was not in my mind at all, because I would maybe drink 2 or 3 times a week, cut like a drink. And then I had low level fatigue, and that disappeared.
Yeah.
And I didn't notice either of those things until about a week later.
Yeah.
Whereas one was, I was at the bar and I was buying a round of drinks, and I just was like, oh, I'll just get a lemonade. I was like, oh, that's weird. And then I just almost noted. I was like watching myself over the next few weeks going, yeah, why am I never pouring myself a drink? And then the fatigue, it was like, oh, the last 2 weeks I've been like, when it comes to at night, and I would usually just get very tired, oh, that's gone.
Yeah.
But it felt like I was in this 8-hour dream, that something had been shaken up in the signifying chain in my mind, and things had settled slightly differently. And it wasn't world-changing stuff, but it did shake something up.
Yeah.
And that's where I was like, oh, that's interesting. That's not like, and again, everyone has access to that, even in your own self. You don't even need music or art. You don't need anything. You can do that sitting on your own. But it is a potential tool that can do that.
And I think one of the, where I think in my entire life have always sort of rolled my eyes is when something gets blown up. So like, take this, you're going to see God. You know what I mean? It's like the branding sometimes of these things, because I really think that sometimes it's these subtle, literal experiences that are the things that really have impact upon our lives, and we don't even like your experience. Because I remember you saying, "Oh, I've stopped drinking," and I was like, "Wow," you know. And you still haven't drunk, and it's been a couple of years.
Oh, yeah, it's been 3 or 4 years.
Yeah, I mean, it's amazing.
It's crazy.
And because everybody used to bring you bottles of gin, which you drink.
Yeah, I know, and I feel bad every now and again. People occasionally buy me one, and I'm like, "Oh, I'm so sorry." Like,
No, it's interesting, but so. I mean, I don't think we're solving any, answering any questions here, but I actually don't think there needs to necessarily be. I think what we were interested in really was just raising this up, because it doesn't always get discussed in the environments that we're in. And I was telling you about, I went to this Christian conference years ago, like in the late 90s, and a guy from a thing, you know, that it was called the 9 o'clock service, which was really
very influential to me, and
very influential kind of alternative experience before, like things like the Emerging Church, or even what they called the alternative worship stuff here.
Yeah.
They had they called it a cosmic mass in the basement of a church, and it was born out of rave culture. Yeah. So it had this kind of DJ dance thing. And this guy at a Christian conference, and this is like, I think it was like 1998 or something like that, was talking about ecstasy, theology and religion. And people were incensed But that was really the last serious conversation I think I ever heard in the world of theology.
Yeah,
I mean, because I when I taught theology, I used to do a whole thing on the psychedelic roots of Christian worship, because the hippies that converted in the 70s brought their music with them, and the music was born of the ecstatic experiences of counterculture. And I used to do this thing where I showed a picture of people in a Hindu temple, people at Woodstock, and people in a church, all in black and white, and they're all doing this because it was presented as, in all environments, as ecstatic, out of body. And the whole essence of like Christian worship music is escapist. And I don't even mean that judgmental, it's just an observation that it's at its root, it's the opposite of the facing of oneself and the absurdity of life.
And this is where, and you helped me in this a lot, because this is where the drug culture and perennial philosophy are very intertwined, and also drug culture and Stoic philosophy can be very intertwined. So either people take drugs like MDMA or to have that God experience. So it's almost like it's just reaching certainty and satisfaction in a different mode. Then there's people who take it as a way to cope with the difficulty of their material life. So they do it as a way to, in a sense, a Stoic kind of way. And I guess if I'm saying anything in this conversation, I don't think I'm saying very much. It's the thing that I'm trying to explore is, these things are not necessarily tied to those. And there might be a way to explore them as a tool or a technology that is existentially useful. And that's interesting to me. And that's kind of like, and also I've always said and made jokes about it, but like in Northern Ireland, if you take a drug or you do drink, you don't have to make it mean anything. It's just, you just do it with friends. Whereas when you went to LA, everything was to become more creative, to unlock something, to meet God. Like it had to be productive. It was woven into productivity. It was woven into being an entrepreneur of the self, self-hacking, biohacking. And it was kind of like, what used to be a way of just chilling out for a couple of hours and became woven into being a more productive person.
It's that kind of American-based pragmatism and utilitarianism that sort of penetrates anything and everything, from philosophy to psychology to drugs. You know what I mean? It's like this has to achieve a particular end in order to have value, rather than the value is just in the experience for what it might be.
And the truth is, maybe like that is actually where drugs, where the power of them is. So in terms of sacrifice, religion, basically starts with sacrifice, and there's the idea that without sacrifice there is no meaning. So every society has to have non-economic space. And George Bataille would say even the religious festival is where, and even music festivals today are a place where you go, you waste your money, you damage your body. It's like the religious sacrifice where you kill an animal, not to eat it, the best animal, which you would usually sell or eat. You destroy it with no return. And where it became then idolatrous is you're trying to make God do something, but technically the sacrifice isn't even to please or influence the gods. It's an absolute sacrifice. And something like cigarettes, the interesting thing about cigarettes is, if you make a cigarette that's healthy, you might be taking away the very ingredient that people unconsciously like about a cigarette, which is precisely its destructive end dimension. So potentially, even when you try to say that drugs have all these positive values, maybe at their core, what makes them in good and bad ways so addictive is that there's an element in which there's a sacrifice, a destructiveness to it. It's a non-productive dimension that's even damaging to your body. And is it possible to kind of like almost so to consciously see that? So is it not unconscious? You think you're trying to meet God, but actually you're engaged in this activity. It's just burning up your dopamine and kind of damaging your brain and doing your memory, short-term memory, fucking that up. Can you do? Well, I do a little activity that's not really good for me. And it's not really productive. But I don't do it very much because you can't do that too much and you'll die. But you almost need something in your life that has no value. So
and therein is its value.
Yes, exactly.
Its value is. Yeah. I mean, it's there's this notion that meaning is always connected to. It's like there's a really interesting Elvis Costello song, and there's a line is in there. It's all this useless beauty. It's a sort of love song about going through a museum, and it's useless beauty. And yet, of course, it's not useless.
Yeah.
It actually is what infuses the world with something that without it you feel.
It's the beautiful, because the term priceless is so beautiful. Because when something is technically priceless, it's taken out of the market because it has no price.
It's worthless and priceless at the same time.
Which is amazing. So it's like it's absolute excrement shit, and it's absolute perfection. It's you say worthless and priceless are both forms of being removed from the social order. And a museum is technically, of course, there are prices, but technically a great work of art is priceless, meaning it has no utility at all. It's a pure sacrifice and a pure beauty, which is a way of understanding, which we'll get it, but almost that psychoanalytic idea of pure lack breeds pure excess. That's so this idea of jouissance. There's something about there's the world of economy, and then there are things that are outside of that, and those are the most interesting things,
Oh, is that it then?
Well, any closing? How would you sum up?
Turn on and drop out, children. No. I mean,
in a nutshell,
I do think that. I mean, I neither advocate for or against this, really. I don't. People have to work that out for themselves. And given the illegality of some of this stuff, that's a question that you have to work out on your own sort of ethical terms. I do think that if you're interested, it's worth thinking, doing a little sort of reflection on what impulses make, what is it you're looking for, and why do you think you might find it in there, and sort of think through, I don't know, think through your symptom perhaps. Do you know what I mean? And realize that it will not give you the satisfaction you're seeking. In fullness. There is no paradise. The paradise is neither lost nor found. We live. I mean, I like it that you're doing this whole thing on Camus, because I love Camus, and I've lived a long time sort of with, and as have you, we've even talked about it at a few of the events, this notion of the absurdity of existence. But I do think in some ways that's where psychedelics particularly can be interesting in helping you realize how absurd it all is.
Yes. Yeah. That's again, so that's my thing of I'm trying to figure out how potentially these things, so there can be medical benefits. I'm glad people are exploring that. There may be therapeutic benefits. People are exploring that. In terms of people personally doing something, it's can it help us live the absurd, have the courage to embrace that, rather than be an escape from that? And that's the question I'm exploring. And of course, I think that, like you said at the beginning, there's not one size fits all in that. And also, I'm a big believer, and we all, as you said, have to find ways of like going to the movies, having a few drinks, doing whatever it is sometimes just to let her hair down. It's the inflatorry kind of like, she said, like anybody I know who got really into this stuff is, they'll all say the same thing. Pretty much either it really messes you up, right? If you start taking it every week and whatever, or the effect, you start chasing what you got in the first few times, and you're literally, your body can't produce the serotonin to kind of keep giving you that high. Yeah. So it can't, even if it gives you respite, it's not the answer. Like
No, and again, it's like anything. I mean, I've always had a tension in life because I don't drink. Yeah. And I've never been much of a drinker. I mean, I don't like not drink, but you know me.
Yeah, I've never seen you drink.
I might have 3 glasses of wine in a year, and I do not like alcohol, and I don't like being around drunk people. Yeah, you know what I mean. Yeah. But it's a sanctioned excess in our cultures. You know what I mean. Yeah. Getting shit-faced drunk somehow is completely acceptable. Yes, and that's not the case with the world of drugs. There are like varied opinions. I read in the paper today that in Thailand they just recriminalized weed. They decriminalized it and it boosted tourism. Now, and part of the argument is they got too many tourists. And they're the same in Amsterdam. With the hash cafes. People going to Amsterdam just to get wasted. To me, that's I don't know, kind of a silly thing to do.
Like out of all the drugs, weed's the one that I have, in some respects, the most issue with, because there's certain things, like I know people who do drugs on a regular basis, and the funny thing is people who swear by things like magic mushrooms, right? And then I ask them, well, how often do you do it? And they're, maybe every 3 or 4 years. Right? And they're waxing lyrical about how amazing it is, and they do it. Whereas I could count 10 people, 20, 30 people off the top of my head who do weed almost every day, and which I'm not against, but I think it can, that kind of potentially lowers your motivation. It does kind of sedate a lot.
Well, it's like I mean, really, it just becomes a habit. And anything that becomes habitual, I think, loses its vitality. There's this fine line between, routine, ritual, and habit. And I think when something becomes habitual, you're sort of perhaps not aware that you're silently chasing the thing that you're actually nullifying by the constant. I don't know.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And
again,
I'm catching myself on here because you know a lot more. Like I'm literally just talking. It's funny. I don't like talking about stuff that I haven't thought through really well. It's a bad habit of mine. But actually, I enjoy just reflecting on this, and don't want anybody to hear that I'm thinking like I've landed on stuff here.
No, I haven't either.
It's almost like this might be the beginning of some conversations we might want to have.
Well, I think, given what's in the ether that we're all swimming in right now, it's an important conversation. I think it's probably a sensible conversation to be having, to think this through from a bit of a more reflective place, to go, well, what is going on here? Because when you even over the time we've been talking, I've sort of realized how, there's a rise of mysticism in our time. Stoic philosophy is everybody's. You go into a bookshop, and the self-helps, how to live like a Stoic. And there's also this resurgence. So there are some little markers coming along, and I don't know. I think it's fascinating.
And there's also, which we won't get into now, but like we were talking last night with our friend Chris, and about obviously the rise in what's called autism, and we can talk about the definition of that or whatever. But it's also interestingly, like, there's potential in which some drugs give people a type of autistic experience, which is, you kind of move into yourself. Some actually make you much more loving or whatever, but there's a sense in which autism can sometimes be seen as a great response to a world that is difficult. You know, like you're in one sense creating a more stable, private environment in a world that it's more and more difficult to insert yourself in and find yourself in. And so having a conversation around psychedelics, for example, and the material kind of like chaos of contemporary world, the rise of autism, the interesting stoicism, also the trad revival and the return to ecstatic religion. And, you know, these are conversations that are worth having.
Yeah, very much so. You've ever read that book, the story of Foucault and his LSD trip in Death Valley in California?
Oh no.
Oh yeah, he was at a conference at Claremont. And the guy that was hosting the conference invited him to Death Valley, you know, and Foucault took LSD, and it transformed his whole thinking.
Is that right? I mean, he was pretty into drugs after that. So that was his first time.
I think so. Yeah,
or pretty much.
Yeah, it's a great book. I wish I could remember the title, but I'm useless with book titles and authors. But it's a fascinating tale.
Oh, very good, very good.
So I don't know.
All right. Well, we'll have more of these conversations. Hope that was enjoyable to you. See you soon.
Bye.
Bye.